All right, let's dive into the huge puzzle that is modern China. I mean, how did a country run by the Communist Party become this global center for capitalism? The story is definitely not what you think, and it all starts with a simple observation, even before setting foot in the country.
This one sentence from our source really just gets right to the heart of it all. From thousands of feet up in the air, the first look at Beijing just didn't match any of the stereotypes of a socialist nation. And what was seen on the ground? Well, that didn't just confirm the feeling, it practically screamed it from the rooftops.
So just picture this. You land in the capital of a supposedly communist country, and what do you see? 10-lane superhighways, a skyline that's just jammed with all these unique, super modern skyscrapers, and then you see the signs everywhere: Rolex, McDonald's, Pizza Hut. But it wasn't just the big guys. The little side alleys were totally alive, just bustling with small, privately owned shops. This was capitalism, plain and simple, and it was everywhere.
So that leads us to the big question, right? How on earth did this happen? How did a country that was under the absolute iron-fisted rule of dictator Mao Zedong turn into this engine of market activity? Well, to get our heads around the present, we've got to go back and look at China's incredibly brutal past.
Okay, let's rewind the clock to the era of Mao Zedong. He had this grand ambition to industrialize China like overnight. So he came up with a plan called the Great Leap Forward. Turns out it would become one of the deadliest social experiments in all of human history.
The scale of this tragedy is, well, it's just horrifying. 45 million people. And this wasn't some natural disaster. No, this was the direct result of a government policy. The source is very clear about this. These were completely unnecessary deaths.
So, the Great Leap Forward was Mao's big idea to rocket China into an industrial superpower. And his method? Something called radical collectivization. He forced millions and millions of people onto these huge state-run farms called communes. But the result wasn't progress, it was complete and utter devastation.
And look, this wasn't just a bad economic plan. It was built on sheer brutality. The government took everything, all private property, land, tools, even people's cooking pots. And those pots, along with actual farm equipment, were melted down in these little backyard furnaces to make completely useless steel. This whole system was held together by terror and violence, and millions were executed or just deliberately starved to death.
The human cost was just unimaginable. This quote from a survivor named Lee Schoolin really paints a chilling picture of how desperate things got. People were reduced to eating tree bark and grass just to stay alive. It's just a raw look at the reality behind all the political slogans.
But the horror wasn't over. After the total catastrophe of the Great Leap Forward, Mao launched something called the Cultural Revolution. This was another decade of pure terror, all designed to purge society of anyone he thought was a counter-revolutionary. It led to millions more deaths and really cemented Mao's legacy as one of history's greatest mass murderers.
But then, after Mao died in 1976, something dramatic happened. A new leader, Deng Xiaoping, came to power, and he took a totally different approach to rebuilding China. It was pragmatic. And this right here is where the story of modern China really kicks off.
I mean, the contrast between these two guys could not be more clear. Mao was totally obsessed with ideological purity, and it led to famine and stagnation. Deng, on the other hand, he cared about one thing: practical economic development. He basically tossed out the old communist playbook and started embracing market reforms, which led to incredible growth. And this famous quote from Deng just perfectly sums up his whole philosophy. He didn't care if a policy was communist or capitalist. All that mattered was whether it worked, whether it could catch the mice of poverty and stagnation. So in a way, he let the capitalist cat out of the bag. And he did it bit by bit. First, farmland was given back to individual farmers to manage. Then, those farmers were allowed to sell any extra food they grew for a profit in private markets. Pretty soon, small private businesses were made legal. And then came the biggest step of all. The Constitution was changed to officially recognize private property. And the numbers? Well, the numbers speak for themselves. In 1980, China's economic freedom score was a terrible 3.64 out of 10, like one of the worst in the world. But just 10 years into these reforms, by 1990, that score had almost doubled to 6.40. This wasn't a slow trickle. This was an explosion of change. So what happened in the real world when this capitalist cat was let loose? Well, the transformation was, frankly, miraculous. It completely changed the face of the country and the lives of hundreds of millions of people.
To even call it a success feels like an understatement. The source material straight up calls China's economic rise one of the greatest successes of its kind in human history. The speed and the scale of it all were just completely unprecedented.
Now let this number really sink in for a second. In just 30 years, 750 million people were lifted out of absolute poverty. That is the biggest and fastest poverty reduction ever recorded in history. That's the human result of those policy changes we were just talking about. And if you want a perfect visual of this transformation, you just have to look at Shanghai's Pudong district. Back in 1990, it was basically a slum. But then it was named a special economic zone, which gave it more economic freedom. Today, it's that futuristic skyline we all recognize, a global financial hub, built in less than a generation. But, and this is a huge but, here's the major twist in the story. This explosion of economic freedom did not come with political freedom. Not at all. China basically embraced the money-making parts of capitalism while keeping the iron grip of a communist police state. There's this one story from the source that just captures this tension perfectly. The author gets invited to speak at a conference in Beijing. It was put on by Unirule, a private Chinese think tank that promotes free market ideas. And get this, the topic was the fiercely anti-communist writer Ayn Rand. Think about that for a second, a conference on Ayn Rand in Beijing. The whole thing was just completely surreal. Well, that surreal moment didn't last long. The day after the conference started, the government brought the hammer down. They blockaded the building, shut the whole thing down. They put the think tank's 88-year-old founder under house arrest, and later they shut down Unirule's websites and kicked him out of their offices for good. The message couldn't be clearer. Economic talk is fine up to a point, but intellectual and political freedom, absolutely not. But even with that huge risk, the desire for change is still there, just under the surface. While driving past Mao's mausoleum, the author overheard this quiet, candid conversation. It's just a small thing, but it's a powerful little glimpse of the hope for political change that still exists, even under all that repression. So what does it all add up to? Well, the source argues that China didn't just ditch communism for capitalism. It's more complicated. It evolved from this brutal, poor totalitarian state into a prosperous but still very active police state. The markets are open, sure, but your success often depends on who you know in the Communist Party. It's this unique and often contradictory hybrid system. And that really brings us to our final question. China's story proves that opening up markets can lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. But it also shows that this can happen while the state keeps an absolute grip on political control. So it leaves us with this thought to ponder. What is the ultimate price for having all that prosperity but without any real political freedom?